General thoughts is this. I met Rabbi Kessler maybe 6 months ago, and there was a warmth, there was an engaging, he was just very, very sweet and bright, and we actually spent some time talking alone. We were with other people, but at a certain point in the evening we were able to speak alone, and I was just so taken by his sincerity and his chizuk, and he invited me to come down to be part of this experience, and I can't tell you how special it's been. The people, the program, the recovery has been phenomenal. Recovery, as I see it, is a group effort. One of the people who became a tremendous mentor of mine back in the 80s told me that recovery is a team sport. If you excel at team sports, you're going to do okay in recovery. If you're a one-to-one, one-on-one sportsman, sportswoman, it's going to be a little bit more challenging. And what I've seen at this Shabbaton is just team. I've seen people reaching out to people. I've seen people sharing from their hearts. I've seen tremendous laughter and joy. And I've also seen some emotional, some crying, but a lot of love, a lot of caring and love. What I loved, and it's part of Chabad, it's part of a synthesis, I think, with Chabad and recovery, which happened to be two ways of life that were made for each other. The ruach, the spirit, in terms of singing and dancing. Havdalah last night was such a spiritual experience. I don't know that I wasn't shocked about it, but it was just, it's always a pleasant feeling when you see that synthesis of music and singing, particularly during Shabbos. I think that it happened the way it was supposed to happen, and that's what recovery is about, and that's what Yiddishkeit is about, that it happens the way it's supposed to happen. I say this tongue-in-cheek, I say this facetiously. The food was phenomenal, and that is a double-edged sword, particularly for people that have any kind of overeating problems. I don't know. It was really perfect in every way. Well, I was hired right out of graduate school when I was about 24 years old to be a staff social worker at an alcohol outpatient clinic about 60 miles north of New York City. And so I was new to the field of addiction treatment. I was right out of the social work program at Columbia University, and to be honest with you, we learned almost nothing about chemical dependency. This is back in the late 70s. And coming into the 80s, I was a neophyte. I was a kid, and Hashem put me in this clinic, I realize now. I was with people that were generally 30 years older than I was. They were all recovering people, and I have to tell you, they taught me about AA. They taught me about NA. They taught me about Al-Anon. They taught me the disease of addiction, and they were tremendous mentors and teachers. They taught me about group therapy. They taught me about family therapy, and from there I started getting more and more integrated into the field of addiction treatment and learned the recovery culture. It's a great question. I guess because in the frum community, in the metropolitan area, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, people come. There's not a lot of, my practice is almost all Jewish and great percentage frum. So the Orthodox community is getting better and better and more well-versed in addiction treatment and treatment for the family members, for children, for adolescents, for spouses. When I step back and I look at the evolution, at least in my time, there certainly is, without overstating this, there certainly is more of an understanding about the disease, about the fact that people don't wake up one day and say, I have a problem. Family members don't wake up one day and say, oh, my child has a problem, or my husband or my spouse, my wife has a problem. they're starting to see that this happens over time. They're starting to see that it's nobody's natural state. It's nobody's choice, and yet there is solution. There are things that can be done in terms of proper treatment, medical treatment, biological treatment, and certainly psychological and emotional and behavioral treatment. And so the stigma about chemical dependency is lessening. We're not there yet. We have a long way to go. But I think one of the things that's very, very telling is there are resources today that never existed. There is the program, the 12-step programs have gotten stronger and stronger. They're more widespread, and there is a Jewish segment that's integrated in 12-step programs, and there's some parts of the Jewish segment that seek their treatment with people like me that are not only trained in addiction, but also are practicing a lifestyle of Yiddishkeit that they feel comfortable with. So there's been some growth. There's more to do. We have more education to do. We need to do prevention earlier and earlier and earlier. We need to get to kids in school systems, in shuls, and families earlier and earlier to help them in age-appropriate ways. You don't speak to a second grader the same way you speak to a seventh grader, the same way you speak to an 11th grader. But there are educational components of prevention to let people know, to let the parents know that if there are signs, if there are the beginnings, the early stages, we need to intervene. Great question again. My first advice is prior to that, in a precursor and preventive way, for every Rav to learn about this condition, to learn about this, to embrace the condition of chemical dependency as something that's out there in our community. The potential, the susceptibility, the vulnerability is out there. Not for everybody. There are people that drink. Most people that drink do not have problems. But for the Rav to learn about this and to develop his own resources so that if and when this comes up, he is not alone. He's able to have a confidant, a therapist, a professional, an expert, a specialist in this field that he can make a phone call to and run by a situation and get the right help at any level of the evolution of the stages and the progression of this illness. It's a progression that once you have it, it doesn't reverse itself. It keeps going, different rates of progression, different things happen. Transcending all of that is that people start to lose things, whether they're young kids or they're middle-aged people or they're elderly folks. When they contract this illness, they start to suffer problems, and the problems are really equated to loss. They lose things. They lose self-esteem. They lose cars. They lose jobs. In the beginning, it's very hard to see. For the Rav of a community to have not only knowledge, but support in the professional field is, I think it's essential. It's critical. The spouse and people in general, but particularly the spouse, is often in a conflict in terms of what to do and how to seek help versus keep this a secret because of the stigma, because of shame and embarrassment about this condition, this chemical dependency, chemical abuse, whatever euphemism we use. The spouse is torn often between, do I tell anybody? Do I go for help? Or do I keep this to myself and try to fix it myself? And the reality in my experience is it doesn't get fixed by one person. And again, it's a team effort, as I said earlier. It's my strong direction and encouragement to any spouse who is in the beginning or the middle of this issue, certainly at the late stages, but usually people intervene before then, to go and learn what this is that he or she is dealing with. If it's a husband that's dealing with a wife that has an alcohol problem, or in our society, more often a spouse, a wife who's dealing with a husband, although the rate of alcoholism, believe it or not, is somewhat similar in the secular community, the spouse is encouraged to get help. It doesn't mean you have to take an ad out in the newspaper and tell everybody that your husband has a drinking problem. But it means that you need to get public with at least somebody who understands this illness. And that leads to some very potentially positive things. That can lead to the spouse getting information and support. And being able to integrate into a network of family members that are working on how they deal with this, which essentially involves, in a nutshell, how they begin taking care of themselves and taking the focus off of the alcoholic and onto themselves and their children, and continuing to get well in spite of the alcoholic. And often the alcoholic at some point, and there are all sorts of interventive, very specific, specialized techniques and experiences that can be put into place for the family once the spouse, as the healthy leader of this family at this point, because the alcoholic is not in any position to make decisions. The alcoholic's in a position eventually to surrender and to say, okay, I give up, let me get help, I'll do it on your terms, it's not working my way, my denial is not working either. But the spouse is often the person who leads the charge. And so for the spouse to seek out professional help with trusted family members, extended family members, if there are these folks in the network and the social network of the spouse, we encourage spouses to seek support and to get support. Al-Anon, Nar-Anon are two family programs. They're offshoots of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous that specifically help family members and are filled with a myriad of different family members, many who are spouses. Without making it sound too simplistic and generalizing too much, I would say that this disease of chemical dependency, of which people, when they find out they have it, are responsible and they're accountable. It's not an excuse. It doesn't mean that just because a person contracts this illness at any age, no matter when they realize that they're not responsible. They're responsible now for doing something right with their lives and getting into recovery, and that if they do have problems with chemicals, with any kind of alcohol or other drugs, mood-altering, habit-forming substances, that abstinence, in my book, seems to be the way to go. I've had countless people come in the first session and ask me, can you teach me how to drink like a mensch? Can you teach me how to drink normally? And it just doesn't work for somebody who's crossed over the line. With that said, this is a treatable illness. This is a treatable condition. It's treatable for the families, and I have to say that sometimes families need to get well first. Sometimes it's only families that get well, and then the alcoholic or the addict, the chemically dependent or chemically abusive person, starts to follow suit, because when the family gets well first, things start to change. What was acceptable becomes unacceptable in a healthy way. And family members sometimes are called on to lead the way, even when their loved ones are reticent and in denial and just not ready yet to get well. So my message, the general message is, this is treatable. It's something that in a crazy way, and I say this with hesitation, but I need to say it, when somebody has this issue, when somebody has this illness of chemical dependency, and their family members are affected by and large, and they seek recovery, and they get into recovery, and they start integrating Yiddishkeit and recovery, their life starts to get better, and at some point, and I've heard this over and over and over again, at some point, they look back on the beginning and the challenging, trying, emotional time that they were neither here nor there. They knew they had a problem. They knew they needed to do something. And they look back and they say, Hashem has given me a blessing, a bracha, for contracting this illness because of what happens when I see it through and I get well. The irony of the question is that in some ways there seems like there's tremendous separation, and the two subcultures, the recovery culture or the culture where there are problems versus the community at large, are somewhat separate. What the research says over and over again, and has been really verifying for decades now, is that 1 in 4 people in this society we live in, from or non-from, Jewish or non-Jewish, has been affected by some kind of chemical dependency or other process addiction. Which means that, by and large, people will see from near or from afar some connection with a person they know, either a coworker or somebody in their extended family or somebody in their extended social network or their community who actually has a problem with alcohol or some kind of substance or some kind of process. Process being gambling, being internet, being food addictions, being spending addictions and debtor addictions. And so the community at large is really involved, sometimes very subtly, whether they know it or not. My point is that they come to know it at some point. And it behooves anybody, as I mentioned about the spouse who's directly, daily involved, for people to learn about this illness, just like the Rav who learns in a different way and maybe with a different urgency. People in general are faced with relationships, and at some point they will come in contact, most likely, with somebody who has a problem. It's great to learn the facts. There are tremendous myths and misconceptions about what chemical dependency is. There are all sorts of inaccurate connotations and images, and so, you know, the Skid Row bum who's in my day in the 60s was on the Bowery drinking alcohol out of a bottle that was in a paper bag with a heavy overcoat in the summer, that stigma and that picture is 1 or 2 or 3 at the most out of 100 alcoholics. So there are 97 other people with problems with addiction that don't look like that man. They look like you and me. They look like people that are functioning and that, exactly, right. I'll give you a recurring theme with folks that I deal with for the last 33 years, and that is that many of them, I can't say all of them, but many of them have, over a period of time in treatment, begun 12-step recovery, developed time of sobriety and abstinence, and have been removed from drinking and drugging. And as they go through that process, because of the many, many paradoxes of recovery, they start to become helpers as they're getting helped. We have a phrase in the recovery culture that says, you can't keep it unless you give it away. It's true of Yiddishkeit as well. And it's true of teaching and learning in a more general, transcending basis. And that is that you really, to learn something, you need to teach it over, because it reinforces your own commitment and your own knowledge and your own learning. And so over and over and over, I see newcomers that are sometimes crawling into 12-step meetings, crawling into my practice, and we work together, and they start to take some direction, and they start to follow advice and follow through, and before you know it, at some point, they are now helping. As well as getting help, they continue to keep it green, to remember where they came from, which is another tenet, another cornerstone of Yiddishkeit. They remember where they came from, and they pass it on. Passing it on is a huge, huge process. So when you come into the program of Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, and the family programs as well, one of the strong, strong suggestions is to get a sponsor. That's what a newcomer needs to do. A sponsor is somebody who is a guide, who teaches the steps, who is somebody you call regularly, who you check in with, who you go to for advice, and you go to for reinforcement and encouragement, and you go to hear honesty. And so the newcomer that I treat is encouraged to get a sponsor when they get into the program. It's incredible how over time they themselves become sponsors. And now they have a sponsor, because every sponsor needs a sponsor, just like every Rav needs a Rav and every therapist needs a therapist or a supervisor or somebody to bounce information and cases and emotional issues off of. They now have become a sponsor. Sometimes after a couple of years of being in the program and working the steps and doing the deal, walking the talk, walking the walk, we call it, and practicing the principles, they now are in a position to be a sponsor to a newcomer. And this is how the Masorah gets moved down from generation to generation. So you have sponsors that have grand sponsors and great-grand sponsors, and this is how the program just continues to grow and flourish. I want to thank Rabbi Kessler. I want to thank you for taking the time to ask me these questions. Without being too dramatic, I think that this is an experience. This Shabbos, continuing today on Rosh Chodesh Adar, is an experience that has touched the lives of a bunch of people. And the more people who can learn and get involved, who need to get involved, will reap the benefits of this effort that you folks are involved with. And I'm just happy to have been invited to be part of it.